Today, we are diving deep into a fascinating linguistic and theological debate. It's a question that really gets to the heart of history, language, and faith. And believe it or not, it all revolves around a single name. All right, so let's get right to the heart of it. The big question our sources are tackling is this: what was the original correct pronunciation of the Messiah's name? We're going to follow this specific linguistic trail they lay out, which argues that one of these pronunciations, Yahshua, was the original, and the other, Yeshua, actually came about much, much later because of some very specific changes. Okay, so before we can even get into the weeds of the debate, we've got to start with the foundation, the meaning of the name itself. And according to our sources, this is one area where pretty much all biblical scholarship finds some common ground. So, check this out. At its core, the name isn't just a word, it's actually a full-blown sentence. It defines a mission, a purpose. Yahweh is salvation. This single meaning is the bedrock for the entire discussion, and is absolutely key to understanding the arguments we're about to explore. And what's really fascinating here is the consistency our sources point to across all these major reference works. I mean, look at them. They all show how these dictionaries and lexicons break the name down into two distinct Hebrew parts: the name of the Father, Yahweh, and the word for salvation. This deconstruction is really the launch pad for the entire argument. All right, so let's zoom in on that first part of the name, Yah. According to the sources, this piece, it has a fancy name, it's called a theophoric element, is absolutely central to their case for that specific Yahshua pronunciation. You know, the whole argument really hangs on this one idea, this premise they pull right from the scriptures. The idea is that the Messiah's name had to contain the name of the Father, Yahweh. It wasn't just a label, it was a declaration of his origin, his authority, the whole shebang. And this table just breaks it down perfectly. It really shows you the two building blocks of the name. On one side, you have Yah, which they identify as the short form of Yahweh. And on the other, you have Shua, which comes from Yasha, the Hebrew word for to save. You put them together, and bingo, Yahweh is salvation. So here's the kicker. The sources are making a really big point here. Yah isn't just some random sound. It's the standalone, sacred, short form of the Father's name. And they point to other huge biblical names like Isaiah, which is Yeshiah, and Jeremiah, Yirmiah, as proof that Yah was this consistent and holy component in names. Okay, so this is where they bring out the historical receipts, so to speak. They point to these ancient Akkadian tablets, we're talking over 2,500 years old, that show Jewish names starting with Yah. They even cite modern scholars who look at these ancient spellings and confirm, yep, that points to an A vowel. And then there's the big one, hallelujah. Everyone knows it means praise Yah. It has always had that A sound. No one's ever said hallelujah, right? So right about now, you're probably asking the same thing I was. If all this ancient evidence points so strongly to Yah, where in the world did Yeh come from? How did we get to the common pronunciation Yeshua? And the answer, according to these sources, lies right here in this timeline. Look at that massive gap. We're talking nearly 1,000 years between the early evidence and when these scribes, the Masoretes, came along. The proponents of this theory argue that in that huge span of time, a really significant change was deliberately introduced into the written text. And this is the how-to of the change, according to the theory. It all comes down to these tiny little marks called vowel points, because ancient Hebrew didn't really write out its vowels. So when the Masoretes added these points, centuries later, they had a choice. The argument is that they swapped out the kametz, which makes an ah sound, for a sheva, which makes an eh sound. That one little change would flip the name's prefix from Yah to Yeh, just like that. But why? Why would they do that? Well, there's a reason, a theory at least. The sources point to references like the Encyclopedia Judaica to explain this intentional scribal practice. See, there was a tradition of not saying the sacred name Yahweh out loud. So instead, scribes would say Adonai, which means Lord. To make sure no one messed up, they allegedly took the vowel points from the word Adonai and stuck them right into the sacred name YHW. So let's just walk through the process they lay out. It's basically a four-step chain reaction. First, a tradition starts to avoid saying the sacred name. Second, they substitute it with another word, Adonai. Third, they actually change the written text by inserting the vowels from Adonai. And fourth, the result is that any name containing that sacred element gets its pronunciation altered. And they argue that Yahshua became a casualty in this process, turning into Yeshua.
Okay, so we finally get to the real heart of the matter. Why does any of this matter? It's just one little vowel sound, right? Well, for the people making this argument, it is everything. This distinction isn't trivial at all. It carries enormous theological weight.
And here's why it's such a big deal. According to their analysis, that one little sound change has three massive consequences. First, they say it changes the name from a proper masculine name to a feminine noun. Second, it shifts the meaning from the very specific Yahweh is salvation to just the general idea of salvation. And third, and this is the most critical part for them, it completely erases the direct, audible connection to the Father's sacred name, Yah.
And to really hammer the point home, they bring in Joshua from the Old Testament. His Hebrew name is identical. They point out that in early versions of the King James Bible, the translators actually wrote Jesus when they were talking about the Old Testament Joshua. This suggests, they argue, that the translators absolutely knew it was the exact same name. So for them, this solidifies the case that the Messiah's name has to be the masculine Yahshua.
Wow. I mean, this quote really says it all, doesn't it? It shows you just how high the stakes are for people who hold this view. This isn't just about getting some ancient pronunciation right. For them, it is a matter of truth versus error, and it's directly tied to the spiritual well-being of believers. So, after walking through this entire linguistic investigation presented in these sources, we're left with a pretty profound question, aren't we? How much can a theory about ancient languages and scribal practices really shape what someone believes today? It's a powerful reminder of how a single sound, passed down and interpreted through centuries of history, can carry the entire weight of faith and identity for so many.